Hello my dears, I'm truly so excited about this video. When I was in high school I did an independent study my senior year called like Crash Course Deaf Studies or something like that, where I taught myself about ASL and American deaf culture, and the whole time I was just like so inspired and so empowered by the concept of a community of disabled people who didn't see themselves as disabled because they had their own community and culture, and I was like, wow, I really wish I had something like that. That would be so cool. And I still laugh at myself about it. If I had just expanded out to disability studies, I would have realized that growing up chronically ill literally made me disabled, and that we very much have. Anyway, so now that I work as a disability advocate, I think it's very cute to go back and look at my old notes where I wrote about my very first understandings of Crip culture, and I was so amazed by it without making literally any connections to my own experience. And this one was extra fun because I found a bunch of information buried within those notes that I've tried really hard to find for other videos I've made for this channel and have had like a devil of a time trying to track down, and I had it in my high school Google folder the whole time, so I'll look there next time. Now that I'm an older human who knows more about research, I did reread one of these textbooks where the vast majority of my notes on this topic came from and did some more external research to just fact check everything, but overall it seems like Little Me did a decent job, so cheers for them. The plan for today is to talk about the history of hereditary deafness on Martha's Vineyard and how that ties into the history of American Sign Language, and then just kind of pick up the history from there and bring it to today, which makes it sound kind of really boring, but I'm going to try to make it not really kind of boring. I don't know why we always assume history is really boring. I think that a lot of history teachers have failed us. Sorry, focusing on the topic at hand, if you want to learn more about disability history, I have a playlist of all of that stuff up here or over here, one of those two sides. My favorite one in that series is the history of eugenics. I think that was the most interesting of things that I researched. That's also going to come up in this video anyway, so I'm going to plug that video later. 4 things to know before we begin. 1, there's going to be some vague mentions of eugenics and linguistic genocide today, though as always I keep triggering content light and only when necessary. 2, for a quick terminology moment. So important. Deaf with a little d refers to the medical condition, and deaf with the capital D refers to culturally deaf. Many hard of hearing folks identify as capital D deaf if they are within the culture. It's very similar to the more modern comparisons of disabled and crip, if you're not familiar with those as well. Disabled being like you're technically disabled, and crip being you are part of the crip community, you are part of the disabled community, you are culturally disabled. Historically, deaf culture has separated itself from the term disability because they believe deafness isn't a disability, the disability is the world being unaccepting of them, but if we're gonna get technical into the disability rights and disability justice frameworks, most disabilities are just the world being unaccepting of difference and unaccommodating for it, and disabled also isn't a bad word. Some people do feel disabled by their deafness, and that's also totally fine and reasonable, and also ableism affects everybody, so people who are perceived as disabled should all just work together on this and try to get rights and not spend our time arguing who is and isn't disabled. I'm not majorly in the deaf community anymore, but it seems like a lot of activists and younger people are starting to expand their view of disability to not be afraid to use that word to describe themselves, so I may refer to deaf people as disabled at some point in this video. I know that's a very complicated and nuanced and contentious thing in this context, but I did just want to put that out there. That's the language that I'm sticking with. I understand that some of the community may feel otherwise, but I always default to the disability justice framework generally for what I do. 3, in case you didn't know, we'll talk more about this today in depth, but ASL is a real language. It is not universal by any means, and it has a separate grammatical structure from English. The linguistic phenomena that we're going to be talking through today are things that we've seen in the creation of many other spoken languages, and even in the modern slow homogenization and modification of spoken language. Our culture has somewhat ingrained in us the idea that sign languages are less complex and or more primitive, for lack of a better word, than spoken language. That's not the case, so be sure to pay attention and reframe that bias where you can throughout this. And 4, for folks who need it, I am a white person with light brown shoulder length curly hair, and I am wearing a short sleeve dress that is like dark navy blue and has white stars on it. And I'm sitting in front of a plain wall that has green leaves. Alright, let's get into it. So, Martha's Vineyard is an island off the coast of Massachusetts. It's shaped like a weird little hand, kind of. It has an area of about 100 square miles, and the places on the left are considered up island, and the places on the right are considered down island. The island was inhabited by Native Americans for at least about 4,000 years before the Europeans came over, and when they did, according to my textbook, there was a lot less negative confrontation between the two than there was everywhere else. That book was, however, published in 1985, and knowing American history and how we treat indigenous people, I have a feeling things were a lot more contentious and culture squashing and land taking than the book made it sound. As we know, the Mayflower landed itself on Cape Cod in 1620. 24 years later, the first European settlement on Martha's Vineyard was created, and for the next 60 or so years, a handful of families moved over to the island each year until they effectively ran out of space, virtually stopping immigration around 1710. Also, the population there grew really rapidly because most people moving there were young married couples. Everybody had like 8 children at a time generally back then, and there was an unusually high survival rate for infants on the island. The Vineyarders generally just kind of vibed on their own most of the time. They did eventually join the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in 1691, but they kind of just dealt with their own stuff. They didn't really hop into politics much. They did get involved in like the Revolutionary War blockade situation, but that doesn't apply to what we're talking about today, so I didn't look at it super in depth. But they were generally just kind of vibing. A lot of people didn't go to the mainland. Like going to the mainland was like if I were to go to, I don't know, Italy right now. Like it just wasn't a normal thing that people went and did. They began as a farming community, but they quickly overused the land, and so they decided to turn to the sea in the 1700s, becoming a major maritime stronghold along with the next door island of Nantucket, with people from their ports traveling all over the world. Lots of whaling going on, lots of fishing, all that kind of stuff. Most of the ports were down island. The up island stayed primarily farm-oriented and more isolated. That's gonna become important later. In 1835, a Methodist camp meeting came to the island for a bit and then kept coming back every year, way larger than it was the year before, until it was like tens of thousands of people, creating the town of Oak Bluffs and becoming a fully, not necessarily Methodist tourist industry of summer visitors by the mid to late 1800s. Today, about 17,000 people live there year-round, and in the summers it becomes a population of about 200,000. Oh, and also on the island, about 1 in every 155 children born was deaf, which sounds like not a lot, but given that at the time 1 in every 5,728 children were born deaf in the rest of the US, that is a lot. Like a lot. Now the first question obviously is, how did this happen? Which brings us to today's spotlighted book. Oh, it's so far away. Hold up, I'm gonna grab it. Okay, here it is. It's called Everyone Here Spoke Sign Language, Hereditary Deafness on Martha's Vineyard by Nora Ellen Gross. It's just over 100 pages. It's a fairly simple read, so if you do want more information about all of this and don't like reading textbooks, I highly recommend checking it out. It's a really great read. It took me like 4 hours. It was published in 1985, but it's the most thorough understanding of deaf culture on the Vineyard to exist, and will continue to be, given that the majority, if not all of the people who were alive to witness it in real time have since passed away, unfortunately. The written records of things were kind of sketchy in that most catalog documents don't really mention people's hearing status, so she relied mainly on oral history and then went looking for specific documents to corroborate that, some of which had been hiding in boxes in a warehouse somewhere, and it's just really in-depth. I love anthropological studies that are super intersectional and pull lots of different pieces together from tons of different directions. I got to do that for my Pompeii disability video, and it's just a level of satisfying that cannot be understated. We're gonna talk about what life was like on the Vineyard in a little bit, but my favorite thing is how the majority of the time she would mention that somebody was deaf to one of the islanders, and it would be like, huh, oh, I forgot about that. Or yeah, I guess that makes sense now that you mention it. It's just so cute. I love that they just didn't know. But anyway, back to how this happened. The first thought was obviously some sort of deaf causing the illness, but that seems unlikely given the staggering of deaf folks' ages, and also there are no written records of anything like that. If there were a plague, we would have known about it. Photos from the time show no visible physical differences, and there are no records of other symptoms that came along with the deafness, so all signs seem to point to some form of hereditary deafness. Now, let's pause and bring ourselves back to middle school biology. Yes, we're talking about Punnett squares and Mendelian genetics, my favorite. Also, while we're talking about untold disabled history, did you know that Mendel, that guy who created Mendelian genetics, was chronically ill? We love forgetting about how people in history were disabled. Anyway, Punnett squares. So let's pretend that a hearing person and a deaf person who was born deaf got married. Each one has 2 alleles in their genotype. We're going to represent them with a big H being the dominant or more common allele for hearing, and little d being the recessive allele. I know that it's traditional to use the same letter for both things and just have one be capital and one be lowercase. We're not doing that for the sake of clarity. I understand that it's not super scientifically, whatever. So their kids could have 1 of 4 possible combinations of genes from their parents. In this case, they're all the same. Each combination is the same. This combination is called a heterozygous because there are 2 different alleles. The dominant allele is going to generally be the one expressed, so all of their kids would be hearing, but they would all carry the recessive deaf trait. Punnett squares are a bit of a mass generalization. Often these traits that we put in them involve several different kinds of genes, and it's more complicated than this, but for a general understanding, this is effective. Now, one of those kids marries another person who's born with the same deafness that their mom has. Wild! Their kids can have one of 4 different possible combinations. Half of them would be heterozygous and likely be hearing, and half of them would be homozygous recessive and be deaf. Hopefully that made sense. The thing is, there are at least 50 different kinds of recessive deafness and or hearing loss. So if deaf people married each other but had different kinds of deafness, all of their children would most probably be hearing, because in order for a child to be deaf, they need 2 of the identical form of deafness to get passed down to them. And therefore, geneticists tend to regard the appearance of almost any type of recessive deafness as proof that the parents share a common ancestry. And the data we have back up the statistical likelihood of it being a recessive trait. 85% of all children born deaf on the island were born to couples in which both parents were hearing. Where deafness appeared in direct ancestral lines, it would often skip 2 or 3 or in one case 6 generations, as is consistent with a recessive trait. It affected males and females in approximately equal numbers. The first clear record of a known deaf person that the researchers were able to find was a man by the name of Jonathan Lambert in the 1690s. Doesn't mean he was actually the first person, I doubt it, but he's definitely one of the first. But in tracing his lineage, Gross found that the majority of deaf people on the island were not directly related to him. A lot of them were related to a hearing man, and generally no common ancestor could be identified. So she took it back a few more generations to what families everybody was related to and how those families intersect. All the deaf vineyarders had some direct ancestral tie to a group of families who settled on Martha's Vineyard between 1642 and 1710. Which then brings us to the Kentish Weald of England, which is an area that historically was really isolated, and most people married someone from their direct village or the village over, but not much farther out because it was just really hard to get around. I want to be super clear in that I am no way supportive of inbreeding, but I do think that when people think about inbreeding, it's usually in relation to like the way that royal families were really calculated and having people marry within the family to keep the power centralized, and so we kind of mock it when in a lot of places all over the world, again, not saying this is okay or great, but this happens a lot. By accident often, particularly in smaller, more rural communities. And typically, those people don't and didn't keep track of their second and third cousins and whatnot, so they had no idea that it was happening. A lot of the islanders Gross spoke to would say that they had no relation to the others on the island with the exact same last name as them, and that it was just a mere coincidence because they literally did not know how far back things were intertwined and connected. This is called endogamy, meaning marriage within a specific group, which in some situations can be required by custom or law. In others, it can just be what's done because there's no other option. And it's a really common anthropological pattern in smaller communities because of convenience and also like the level of tight-knit social network that it creates, which we saw a lot of in the Kentish Weald. There aren't a ton of records of deafness from back then over there, but there aren't a lot of records of anything from back then in general, particularly in the poorer and less literate areas, which is where the Puritans who came to the New World usually came from, though there is record of Sir George Downing, yes, that one, of Downing Street, having known a sign language and hiring deaf people to work underneath him, and he was born and raised in the heart of the Kentish Weald, which means the deafness and sign language were likely pretty normal and regular to Sir Downing, meaning it was probably pretty normal and regular for everybody else in the region. So when these people left England and they moved to the town of Scituate in Massachusetts, they brought that small gene pool from Kent with them, and they brought it from Scituate to Barnstable and surrounding Cape Cod towns after that, and then they brought it to Martha's Vineyard. In those other places, they had more chances for marriage outside of their community, but once they moved to an island, the circumstances were pretty much the same, to the point where within 3 generations, everybody was related to one of the original families that had come over from Kent by anywhere from 1 to a dozen marriages. And, according to the pedigrees Gross calculated for the study, by the late 1700s, of those who married, over 96% married to someone to whom they were already related. Oh, and remember earlier when I talked about how one side of the island was mostly farming and the other side was mostly ocean related? Yeah, so the notable towns on the left side at the time were Chilmark and Tisbury, and while the prevalence on the vineyard of deafness was 1 deaf person per 155 hearing people, in Tisbury it was 1 to 49, and in Chilmark it was 1 to 25, and in one neighborhood of Chilmark it was 1 to 4. A lot of people came to research this when they learned about it to try to figure what was going on, but the whole Mendelian genetics Punnett square thing that we did earlier was not widely known about until the early 1900s, so the idea of things skipping generations or of somebody's parents and cousins all being deaf but them and their children being hearing didn't hold meaning to any early scientists because they thought everything was just a linear line. So they all just kind of left it as like, runs in families somehow, and that's it. And also the islanders had literally no idea that it was atypical. One person Gross interviewed said something about how she went to university in Boston at one point, like stopped and was like, why have I not met any deaf people yet? This is so strange. I love niche cultures. They're my favorite. Like niche culture shock is just so fascinating to me. Anywho, the Islanders referred to signing as speaking deaf and dumb, which obviously to our ears sounds really offensive, but they didn't mean it to mean that way. Also dumb meant mute, not stupid at the time. But it's also not a word that we should be using to describe anybody at all, ever, because insulting intelligence is also inherently ableist. The language was never formally taught, it was kind of a thing that everybody picked up. It was just an innately bilingual society. And it also appears to have had a separate grammatical structure from English that was used both by the deaf and hearing signers, unlike the literal translations that were common home signs and pidgin signs that were not technically language, often used on the mainland to communicate with a one-off deaf person. And if deaf people were present, everybody simply defaulted to sign without question to be the most accessible to everyone. Hearing people also use speech and sign interchangeably regularly with each other, with characteristic examples of code switching in this culture for tone and meaning, and also logistically a lot of the time the people on the ships used it a lot when they were really far away so they didn't have to scream at each other. Sign language is such a great system for long distance communication, and I love using it for that. The deaf islanders were also better off than deaf folks on the mainland, with rates of marriage, income, and land ownership equal to their hearing neighbors and much higher than on the mainland, and some even considered high in comparison to deaf folks today. There's no explicit evidence of deaf kids going to the mainstream schools on the island, but again, records are sketchy, so they very well may have, and also we know that many of them could at least sign their names because they're on legal documentation, and at the time being able to write your name and understand some sections of the Bible was the standard for education and literacy, so, you know. Martha's Vineyard Sign Language is half the story of where ASL came from. Put a pin in that. We gotta travel to France for the other half of the story. Meet Catholic priest Abbé Charles Michel de l'Épée. I hope I pronounced that right. Truly the most French name I've heard in a while. He was a priest. He did priestly things, most of which somehow involved teaching people about God and religion and faith and Christianity and stuff. I am so good with words. This is why I script my videos before I film them, because if I were just speaking without a script, this is bad in a script. Like, imagine if I was just left to my own devices to just speak freely. Terrible. Where was it? A French guy. In the 1750s, French guy met two 15-year-old sisters who were deaf and used signs to talk to each other, and he wanted to teach them about religion. Or their mother asked him for help to teach them about religion. There's so many different versions of the story. But he learned their signs and combined them with French grammar and some of his own invented signs to teach the girls about religion, and then dedicated the rest of his life toward teaching God and religion to other deaf people. He's known as the first hearing educator interested in actually learning from deaf people themselves. Also, he did think about teaching them speech, but quickly discovered how time-consuming it was without making a lot of progress, and thought it to be a waste of valuable educational time, and ended up abandoning the task. In 1760-ish, depending on the source that you read, he opened the National Institute for Deaf Children of Paris, which was the first official and also free school for deaf children in the world. And many of the teachers at his school were also deaf and also former students of his, such as Jean Massieu. Massieu then taught a guy named Laurent Clerc, who quickly became a teacher there after graduating. Priest guy died in 1789, and Abbé Sicard took over as head of the school. Great. Put a pin in that. Now we need to travel to the US. Thomas Gallaudet was also an important guy. I'm sorry, there are so many names. You don't really need to keep track of these if you don't want to. He was important. He studied a lot of things at a lot of universities. He graduated from seminary. He was asked to be a pastor at lots of different places, but he declined all of them due to health issues. Because, oh my gosh, more chronically ill people in history that we don't talk about it, they were chronically ill. We love to see it. Now, when he was home dealing with his health stuff after seminary, he met Alice Cogswell, the 9-year-old deaf daughter of a neighbor of his who he saw playing away from all the other children, and he felt kind of bad for her because he was like, you deserve to play with other kids and be another kid. So he asked her father if he could teach her. Father said, sure, why not? And they worked together for the summer. And then her father sent Gallaudet off to Europe to study how they teach deaf children over there, because he'd heard really good things, especially about the Braidwood School in Scotland. So Gallaudet goes to this Braidwood School, and they basically say, we're not going to tell you anything about how we teach these students because we refuse to. The way we teach these kids to speak is our special secret. And he was like, okay. Thanks. Yeah. And he also wasn't quite sure if the method of teaching that they were using to teach these kids to speak was actually effective anyway, so he moved on in search of other places to learn from, and at the same time Clerc, Massieu, and Sicard go to England to give a lecture about educational practices. Gallaudet goes to the lecture, they meet each other, and then afterward they invite him to come with them to France to study what they do. Gallaudet learns French Sign Language there, and then he and Clerc come over to the US, where they go on a little speaking tour to raise a lot of money, and then in April of 1817 opened the Connecticut Asylum for the Education and Instruction of Deaf and Dumb Persons, which is now known as the American School for the Deaf in West Hartford, Connecticut. I wasn't able to find specifics of what language looked like at the school. I'm going to assume they just use French Sign Language, at least at the beginning, because it's the only sign language that the two of these guys knew. But in the first few decades of the school being open, the single largest student group came from Martha's Vineyard. And the second largest student group came from Sandy River, Maine, the area that a lot of islanders had emigrated to a few decades earlier, meaning that their sign language was pretty similar to, if not identical with, Martha's Vineyard Sign Language. The rest of the students who came to the school grew up fairly isolated from other deaf people before coming to the school, so what ended up happening very quickly was the creation of a Creole, which is a language that comes from a simplified version of another language and or the mix of two or more languages. In this case, LSF, which is the French letter order for French Sign Language, and MVSL, which then became what is known as ASL today. About 60% of ASL is of French origin, and most Vineyarders struggle to understand ASL because it is so different from their sign language. And this also caused like a huge cultural change on the Vineyard. Many of the deaf people who went to these schools were better educated than their hearing peers because they'd gone to the school for so long with tuition paid by the state, while most Vineyarders could not afford proper education. And as a result, some of the less educated hearing people would occasionally bring a newspaper or legal document to their deaf neighbors to have it explained. Also, most of the deaf kids on the island went to the school and then ended up marrying other people from the school, not from the island, breaking up the lines of hereditary deafness and rapidly depleting the numbers of them on the island. This, in combination with the population spike around the same time, caused the island and linguistic culture to get even further depleted, and by 1900 there were only a handful of hereditary deaf islanders left, with the last one dying in 1952. But that's how we got ASL. Teachers from the Paris school also went to lots of other places as well, so the sign languages of Denmark, the Netherlands, Spain, and Russia, and many others are based on LSF as well, though much like the US were creolized with their local sign languages, because where there are deaf people there is signing. Not all signing is language in the technical linguistic term, but small pockets of deaf and or integrated communities such as Martha's Vineyard have existed all over the world, and in just a few generations complex language systems can and do develop. Over 270 signed languages, dialects, and systems have been identified around the world, and many countries have more than one sign language or signing system as a result of these various pockets creating their own languages over time. Renaissance Spain had a manual alphabet that likely inspired Epe to create one for LSF. Monks who had taken vows of silence commonly used sign systems for basic communication, often with monasteries taking in deaf children to educate them using that sign system. Socrates wrote about sign language in the 5th century. It's been around a while. There are even some theories that evolutionarily sign languages were the first languages humans created before developing the physical abilities for complex speech. Now, going back to Martha's Vineyard Sign Language, how many times can I say sign language in like the span of 5 minutes? As I said earlier, there is some evidence of the existence of a Kentish sign language. That was likely the basis for what MVSL became. Even today, British Sign Language is known for having a wide variety of dialects due to potential pockets of hereditary deafness that had a long time to develop complex language and are now lost to time, as well as the fact that the history of primarily oral-based schools, i.e. ones focusing on speech rather than on signed communication, were more common for longer in Britain in comparison to the French method, causing less formalization of their sign languages initially in the way that the US had. The other sign language that it is very important we do not forget about is Hand Talk, or North American Indian Sign Language. This was a sign language used primarily for intertribal communication, with regional and tribal variants that existed for many generations, with like rock paintings of people doing these signs. One of the most well-documented variations of Hand Talk is the Plains Indian Sign Language, because it was used most widely. Many of these signs are strikingly similar to the ones we use in ASL, likely for 2 reasons. The first being that Native students went to the Connecticut school along with everyone else and included their signs into the Creole being created. Preliminary research on my part did not come up with any specific evidence of any specific Native students. I have not seen that information anywhere. That's the most common explanation. I'm sure there's just aren't records of it, or I'm doing a bad job of finding them. Both of those are very likely. I also didn't do a lot of research to try and find them. The other explanation, if we are to take for some reason there was a lot less negative confrontation between natives and Europeans on Martha's Vineyard than there was everywhere else at face value, it's likely that there was some mixing between Wampanoag Sign Language and the imported Kentish Sign Language in the late 1600s, which may have been the reason they got along more easily than in other places where the settling Europeans didn't sign. I don't have any proof of that, but most of my textbooks on this topic that I have read came out at a time when Hand Talk was seen as a primitive sign system, not a formal sign language, and research now very much refutes that, so to me this feels like the logical next step in connecting the dots, that I just haven't seen anybody connect those dots yet. I don't know. As time went on and Indigenous students were increasingly sent to residential schools, the hearing students were punished for signing and the deaf students were forced to use ASL exclusively, to the point where only a handful of people left are fluent in Hand Talk. There's a wonderful Vox video about this that I do recommend checking out. It breaks down how we understand how people see the world via structures of their language, and one woman who's integrating some elements of Hand Talk with ASL to make it more culturally specific to her. It was really interesting. I'm gonna link it in the description. Now, the way that this story is generally told, it makes it seem like ASL was the the proud standard, and everybody used it for everything other than like the absolute sadness. There's the linguistic genocide of hand talk, and on some level Martha's Vineyard sign as well, and everything was fine and good. But that would be a lie, because this is disability history. We know how this is going. Let me introduce you to the 1880 Milan Conference. Alright, so in September of 1880, a bunch of educators met up in Milan, Italy to decide, once and for all, the best method of education for all deaf students, because, you know, creating one-size-fits-all education systems is always effective. Always the best thing to do, especially when it's for deaf education and all 164 of your members are hearing people. The convention expresses the earnest desire that governments shall make such provisions that all deaf mutes may be instructed. The convention, considering the incontestable superiority of articulation over signs in restoring the deaf mute to society and giving him a fuller knowledge of the language, declares that the oral method should be preferred to that of signs in the education and instruction of deaf mutes. The convention considers that the instruction of the deaf-speaking children by the pure oral method should follow as closely as possible to the methods of instruction of hearing and speaking children. I hope you enjoyed my bad posh accent. I thought it added to the vibes. The general argument was that sign languages were not languages but invented primitive systems, and that in evolution speech replaced sign, and therefore it was the mark of a more evolved human. Insert all of the social Darwinism and eugenicist survival of the fittest garbage we know and love on this channel. And the primary ideal at the base of all of this was speech is what makes something inherently human. Where have I seen this before? Wherever did we talk about the problem with seeing speech and humanity as being equal? Almost like the Turing test. My whole channel's becoming a circle at this point. I love tying everything into each other though, it's so fun and interesting. Also, for the record, the Americans opposed this ruling, saying that a combined speech and sign teaching system based on the needs of the child would be way more effective. They were ignored, and thus began what is often referred to as the Dark Ages for deaf people, because they were forced to hide and be ashamed of their language. And unsurprisingly, depriving someone of their primary form of communication and forcing them to use one that is not made accessible to them in the slightest caused serious issues in the realm of them actually being able to get an education. Barely 10% of students were actually able to master intelligible speech, and most students were graduating high school with a 3rd or 4th grade reading level. Some schools did have a more combined system, with oral failures, who are those who made no progress in 2 to 5 years, getting to learn in sign instead of speech, but that version of sign was usually just finger spelling every single word, which is objectively not sign language. There was the idea that if you teach people to sign, they won't speak, ignoring the fact that most couldn't learn to speak anyway, and we also know that language of any kind helps with speech down the line for anyone, and language deprivation is the biggest problem. Also, speech is not superior. I guess that ship has sailed here. It was a really, really rough time. Many residential schools were replaced by day schools, cutting off the primary communication between students, which happened after school hours in dormitories via sign language, with the express purpose of keeping students as separated as possible to prevent deaf intermarriage, to prevent the birth of more deaf children. And these schools deliberately played into a lot of the common fears of the time to get more enrollment and money, saying like, we're gonna normalize your child, we're gonna make it possible for them to assimilate into hearing culture, we will erase their deafness for you, via making super confused, overwhelmed, quiet, compliant, and ashamed of themselves students. Where have I seen this before? Also, Martha's Vineyard comes back around for a hot second. I've actually talked about this before in the aforementioned eugenics video, so let's roll the clip there. Alexander Graham Bell, who's getting in a very brief info dump because I spent like a month studying this guy a couple years back, and so I need to put this knowledge somewhere or I'm just going to explode. So, Alexander Graham Bell is widely known as the dude who invented the telephone, and while that is true, he's actually a guy that invented the telephone. He's not the first person to invent it, and he beat a woman inventor to the patent office basically by 10 minutes. So now we know his name because, well, he got the patent first. Also, he was creating the telephone because he was trying to invent some sort of way to make deaf people hear again. He was fluent in sign language and supposedly a very beautiful signer, as both of his wife and his mother were deaf, but he was very against the use of the language at all and wanted to eliminate deafness entirely, as well as deaf people. He wrote I guess you could call it a book. It's called Memoir Upon the Formation of a Deaf Variety of the Human Race, and basically he studied deaf families on Martha's Vineyard, completely fudged all of his data to reflect his own opinions, and then the National Academy of Sciences published it. The thing is public domain at this point. You can Google it, you can find a PDF. It's fascinatingly aggravating to read. I won't recommend it. I won't not recommend it. Do with that what you will. If you want to rant, let me know. We can talk. Anyway, he founded the American Association to promote the teaching of speech to the deaf at the same time that he was also the honorary president of the Second International Congress of Eugenics. So, Yeah, anyway, that association is now known as the Alexander Graham Bell Association for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. They actively work to support the oralist movement, which is the deaf people should never speak sign language because it's a bad language and they should only speak and lip read because then they'll be useful to society movement. And they're removing sign language from schools and they've been doing it since the 1800s. It's great. If you choose to work in the deaf community at all and you see Alexander Graham Bell's name on something anywhere, just run in the opposite direction as fast as you possibly can. Alexander Graham Bell, what a guy. Anyway, so Memoir upon the Formation of a Deaf Variety of the Human Race was published in 1884, but the conversation surrounding it continued well into the 1890s and even far after that, and he wrote that paper after doing research on the hereditary deafness of Martha's Vineyard. His goal was to scientifically trace out family lineage to show that deaf people getting married to each other were causing more deaf kids to happen, to try and make the argument that there should be a law saying deaf people can't marry each other or else threaten the creation of a deaf race. As we know from going through our Punnett Square earlier and the fact that even today 90% of deaf children are born to hearing parents, that's not the reality of what he found on that island. So he just kind of put out legitimate family trees and then extrapolated from that, saying he was still right in what he was saying in the most weirdly contradictory, non-scientific ways possible. It's an experience. That being said, what he published was also only a very tiny fraction of the much wider research that he did. Almost like, I don't know, he cherry-picked what he was publishing to try to make his point, but even that didn't really make his point, and it was just bad data collection. But Gross was able to find the rest of those old writings and such that helped her make more clear family trees of deafness on the Vineyard and double-check her findings and use Mendelian genetics to better understand what was going on. So it was useful on some level, I guess, but not for him or for the legislation or anything going on at the time when it was published. There isn't a lot of research as to how this time period of the deaf dark ages impacted the actual language itself, primarily because it wasn't seen as a language at the time, so what linguist was going to look into it? But I would imagine a lot of linguistic changes happened during this time period because the language was primarily taught child to child rather than any sort of formal situation. I should also mention that Black American Sign Language, a dialect of ASL, arose during this period due to the segregation of deaf schools. One thing we do have is from 1913 and 14, where the National Association of the Deaf feared the loss of ASL and formed a motion picture committee that captured signers on film in an attempt to preserve the language in case it died out. Many of the films are very well preserved and you can still watch them, which is really, really cool. I'll play a clip of one here. But then many years later, one linguist did start to look into ASL. William Stokoe, a hearing linguist who is a professor at Gallaudet University from 1955 to 1970, decided to analyze the language using linguistic principles to see if it was in fact a language. And in 1960 he published a book titled Sign Language Structure, an outline of the visual communication systems of the American deaf, which was the first place the term American Sign Language was ever used. In 1965, he and Dorothy Kasterlein and Carl Kronberg, sorry if I pronounced those names wrong, published the first ASL dictionary. I have a copy of it laying around somewhere, I don't know where it is. But the deaf community was actually very displeased about all of this. Many thought it was a waste of time and money. Many were angry that this hearing outsider was meddling and creating new terms to explain their language, and they weren't used to the new name of the language. They didn't really like it being, I don't know, brought outside of the community, I think was the general energy behind everything. But once the initial shock of it wore off, it did kind of catch on, and now we're here. In the 1970s, ASL slowly started to return to schools. That was not really ASL at the time. ASL was still considered unsuitable for classroom use and incompatible with English, so new sign systems were invented, copyrighted, and sold to the schools. Some elements of these sign systems have actually found their way into ASL, and many ASL classes teach English-coded sign systems, primarily SEE, rather than actual ASL, which is really annoying. So if you are going to take classes to learn ASL, make sure that you, have a deaf instructor is going to be the number one thing, but generally check to see if it's English grammar or not English grammar. Speaking of annoying and invented sign systems, this is a great time to rant about baby sign. I used to work in a nursery school for about 4 years. It was a really great time. I used ASL with the kids a lot because for the really little ones, it was a very interesting thing for them to look at. It would keep them occupied and quiet for a long time, but also because a lot of the parents used baby sign with their kids and requested that we also use it as well. And then those parents looked at me like I had 3 heads when I used normal ASL with the children instead of baby sign. The idea of baby sign is that it simplifies signs to be more baby friendly. That would be the equivalent of taking syllables out of the middle of words when speaking to children to the point where they're unintelligible to anybody outside of the two of you, to make it easier for the child to repeat back to you. And also not using any grammatical system at all or having any respect for the language and culture behind the language being used. Yes, children take syllables out of things when they say them back to us, but over time they learn the skills to pronounce things properly, and we need to give them the time and space to do so. That is a developmental thing that happens. And also, having a really intricate code that only works when talking individually with you is unhelpful at best. The allure of baby sign language is that kids are generally able to sign developmentally before they're able to speak, so people will teach them baby signs to communicate during that earlier period while spoken language is developing. I'm not opposed to this. I will be teaching ASL to my children should I have them, but in my experience, most parents use maybe 2 or 3 real signs, most of which are simplified to the point of no return anyway, and then mix it with a bunch of their own personally created signs, and then the second their kid starts talking, they stop using this tool altogether. Gatekeeping language and resources is a problem. I want to be super clear about that. That's not what I mean here. That's not what the deaf community means when they talk about this. But the fact that 70% of hearing parents of deaf children never use ASL with their children, and there are still outdated resources recommending this. Meanwhile, every other parent is like, OMG, sign language is only for babies and there's no grammar, and also I can create any sign I want whenever I want. With a general understanding that it is something that is outgrown and not important or in depth or a language or a culture is a serious problem. In theory, I think all kids should learn ASL. Not only is it important for kids to learn several languages when they're younger, it really helps with brain development. It also, sign language specifically helps with more spatial understanding and seeing the world differently. It's a great access tool for kids with intermittent speech. But the way the baby sign is marketed and used is very much not that, and it does not handle this already underappreciated language with the respect that it needs and deserves. The discussion is less an anger at hearing people using signs with their hearing babies, but about how it's marketed and how so many hearing parents don't use signs with their deaf babies, and there's just a massive double standard. To me, it gives the same energy as the fact that we see AAC button devices as something that dogs use to communicate, rather than tools created for disabled humans to communicate that most disabled humans who need it don't have access to. Same energy. How did I not mention sign language apes already in this video? If you want to learn more about the dog talking buttons and how apes don't know ASL, I have a video about that you can watch up here. Anyway, schools for the deaf today are a lot more variant. Most are somewhere on the balance between including some speech therapy and lip reading training, but primarily using ASL, though the way that the IDEA and ADA legislation is written, deaf students today are primarily mainstreamed, as 53% of schools serving deaf and hard of hearing students enroll only one such student in that school, and at least 80% of schools serving deaf and hard of hearing students have 3 or fewer students with hearing loss or deafness. There's also the fact that ASL interpreters hired by schools for children are a regulatory disaster, and the data there is not pretty. I've spoken about the mainstreaming debate in my ADA and IDEA video, which you can watch up here, but in short, from an educator standpoint, particularly as one who did an internship at a school for the deaf many years ago, unless your mainstream school has a lot of deaf students or really knows what they're doing, schools for the deaf will always be the least restrictive environment for deaf education. If you want them to learn ASL, if you want them to understand most of what is going on and be primarily visual learners, as deaf people generally are more able to do. And also just the level of confidence in themselves and pride that they gain in those spaces is even more important to me than anything, and that was what I appreciated so much about being there. But anyway, let's close out this video by talking about some cool things about ASL, because I love to just talk about how great this language is. The first thing that's maybe less cool is that the language is very white. It's based on white and binary norms, a great example being boy in reference to a cap and girl in reference to like a sunbonnet tied around the face. General feminine things stay in the lower third, masculine stuff stays at the top. But what's really cool is the language over the past few years has been changing to use the cheek region as gender neutral, which I think is really cool. I don't know if y'all are interested in how binary languages are changing for non-binary identities. I don't know if the minimal data available on that right now would even be enough to warrant a full video, but it's really cool. So let me know if you want to learn more about that, and I will. I need to go back more into linguistic content. I missed it. Anyway, ASL is also cool because you can express several concepts at the same time by changing hand shapes or repetitions or facial expressions or otherwise giving things texture and visual descriptors way faster and more in depth than you can speak in spoken language. Finger spelling, the most common thing that hearing people know, like spelling words on your hands, only makes up about 8.7% of casual signing in ASL, and all signs have 3 parts. We have the hand shape, the location in the signing space, and the movement. There are 19 different hand shapes, 12 different locations, and 24 different types of movement. Also, there are classifiers, which is like a subsection of hand shape. They're specified hand shapes that cue certain kinds of things, like this being a car or this being a person. And so you can literally visually tell stories like, oh, this person got hit by a car. It's great. I love it so much. I also love how a lot of signs are based in visually explaining things that no longer exist as the object they were when the sign was created. Like, all languages have outdated words that live on and have no basis behind their meaning, and like those don't exist in our culture anymore. But in ASL you can see it clearly, and it's so linguistically Oh, it's so good. Also, I forgot to mention this, but facial expressions, mouth shapes, eye gaze, and eyebrow placement are also all part of ASL grammar. It's not just on the hands at all whatsoever. For me, as an autistic person, learning ASL helped me so much with comfort around eye contact as well as reading body language and facial expressions, because it's literally part of the grammar and you can find resources that literally explain it to you. Not to mention that deaf folks who are expressive signers tend to overemphasize the rest of their facial expressions, which makes them a lot easier for me to read. So I find sign language communication to be more accessible to me than spoken communication. I don't know if I've mentioned this yet, but I used to be pretty proficient in sign language, and then I had a little brain damage situation when I was 18 and lost a lot of my episodic and visual spatial memory stuff. So my former proficiency of this language has gone down to like understanding grammar rules, using the manual alphabet, and understanding maybe 60 vocabulary words, and that's it. But I don't know, researching this has made me kind of maybe want to go back to it. So we'll see. We'll see. Anywho, that's all I have for you today. I hope that you enjoyed learning about this. I had a fun trip down memory lane, and as always, thank you for listening. Thank you for learning. Remember, it's never too late to start over. I need to remind myself that about this language, and I will see you, my dear, in the next one.